So Blender is getting an exciting updates packed with tons of fresh new features that will up our workflow. And I've been diving deep into Blender 5.0 since the first very alpha version, and it's got some game-changing tools that are really interesting to me, especially for environments and compositing. And to show you what I mean, I have simple environments seen in Blender 5.0 to highlight some upcoming features for environment and digital artist, which I've been waiting for. And the first one is adaptive subdivision. This feature was only experimental in previous Blender versions, now it works right out of the box in Blender 5. Here is how it works and how we can use it. I love using displacement in my arts and cinematic animations, but it always makes my workflow more complicated. For example, if I have some ground surface like this one and I want high details displacement, I need to subdivide the mesh enough to support these details. As we know, the more displacement details we need, the denser the mesh we must have. But in Blender 5, adaptive subdivision lets us subdivide the surface only where it's needed, based on the distance from the camera. In other words, I want high detail displacement right here, closer to the camera, where the details matters, and I don't need anywhere else in the scene. Now, with the new adaptive subdivision in Blender 5, we can subdivide the mesh only in this area near the camera. But before enabling adaptive subdivision in the Subdivision Surface modifier, we need to go to the render settings. There is a new subdivision section here with global options for the entire scene. The key scene is to select your camera. Without choosing the camera, adaptive subdivision will not work properly. Of course, the program needs to know the reference point to decide where to apply adaptive subdivision in the scene. So I've selected my camera here and now go back to Subdivision Surface modifier to enable adaptive subdivision. To make it clear how this works and how it looks, I'll also open the shader editor, and I already have a wireframe node here, and I'll connect the wireframe node instead of base color. The wireframe node visually shows the mesh density or shows the grid of the mesh. Alright, I disable adaptive subdivision, and now we can see how the Subdivision Surface modifier has subdivided our mesh. The wireframe makes it much clearly visible. And if I enable adaptive subdivision, we can see the mesh density now increases closer to the camera here, but the modifier keeps the original grid the further it gets from the camera. By the way, this is exactly why we need to pick the camera in the global subdivision settings, so the program knows where the foreground and background are for us. And switching to the camera view, we can see that the displacement details on the ground surface is high right here near the camera, and it gradually fades away the further the point is from the camera. Here's how it looks in real example. This is my final render, and you can see plenty of details from displacement right here, but way back there in the distance we don't see high detail at all. By using adaptive subdivision, we make Blender's job much easier. This also works for any objects. For example, I added a sphere here and use the new Array Modifier to place the object along the spline, so they recede from the camera. I'll add Subdivision Surface again. By default, the Subdivision modifier applies the same to all spheres. The mesh density of the distant object is identical to the one in front. But when I enable adaptive subdivision, and to make it clear, I'll increase the value, now you can see the distant object have much lower mesh density than the foreground object closer to the camera. That's the essence of adaptive subdivision. It checks how far the object from the camera and decided whether it even needs to subdivide it. For environment works, it's super handy. We don't need to overcomplicate the mesh in the background where it's barely visible while still getting some solid details in the foreground. For displacement in this case, this is some kind of camera optimization in Blender. And since I already touched on the Array Modifier, yes, in Blender 5.0 we have a brand new Array Modifier, as you can see, and it's built on geometry nodes. That's a massive node setup for what used to be a simple array modifier, and now it comes with way more flexible settings. We can tweak everything using tools we're already familiar with, which is super convenient in my opinion. A cool new feature is the ability to create an array by circle right in a couple of clicks. But the most exciting part personally for me is working with curves. We can simply pick a curve and basically scatter the object right along the spline. We have got here randomized settings, scale, rotation, all that. But how we actually use this new array modifier for environment scenes? Let's check it out on my example scene. For example, I've got this fence element and I want to scatter it around the scene, like you see here in the final render. But before, I'd usually use geometry nodes and curves to place object, bridges, fences or similar stuff, but now all this becoming a history, because the new array modifier in Blender 5 can do exactly the same things, only easier and faster. Check it out. I already have this fence part that I wanna use in the scene. I also add a new curve, something like this. It even doesn't matter right now, just a simple curve. Select the object, add a new array modifier, this one, switch to curve mode and pick that curve. Instead of count, I'll use distance in this case because it looks more natural, and set a value. Okay, looks good, pretty obvious I guess, but the trick is we can work directly with this spline. Select it again, go to edit mode, select all vertices and delete them. Everything disappears, but I'm still in edit mode for this spline. Now in edit mode, pick the draw tool here. By default it uses the cursor, but we need surface mode. That's a trick. Now we can draw right on the surface to scatter the fence along the spline. And since this curve is already linked in this array modifier, everything updates automatically. So now I can literally draw fences, bridges, plants, anything you'd use in array modifier. Fast, easy, no extra dons needed. Plus it automatically follows the surface. To me that's an awesome scene. Like I said earlier, I used to build my own node setup in geometry nodes for similar work. Now just pick a curve and draw. Blender 5 is literally adding those details that used to require either creating your own setups or hunting for some extra dons. And the next update straight up obliterates the whole reason paid scattered dons even exists. Blender 5.0 brings us scatter on surface. Yeah, now to work with scattering you don't need anything except Blender, and that deserves your attention. I'm going to work with the same ground surface where we used adaptive subdivision. Right here I can add a new scatter on surface modifier, this one. By default it's already dropped some empty objects onto the surface, but I've got my grass models and bush model ready to use in this scene. I've also grouped this into separate collections by type of models. In Scatter on Surface, I switch to Collection and pick the collection I created for scattering. For viewport performance, we can select all this object and set Display As to Bounds. If you use a collection in Scatter on Surface, you have to enable Pick Instances, so the modifier grabs every object from this collection. We also get Transform and Randomizer controls, which is awesome because there are a core tool for realistic environments. The most important one is Random Scale. It's grass, not a wall or carpet. I also tweak rotation. On the axis I set 45 degrees and for X and Y I got with 15 degrees. That way every object gets its own random spin plus slightly tilt on X and Y for natural variations. Basically, I've got all these essential settings for scattering plants right here in Blender, but you may ask, what about masks to control where the grass goes? And yes, that's built in too. To use a mask in scattering surface, just enable masking here. Hit New, create a mask for grass and set the resolution. No need for alpha. Everything disappears at first because the mask is black. To paint where the grass should appear, switch to texture paint, and important, we can see the mask in the viewport by default, so open here, switch to single image mode and select the mask we just created. Also make sure you use the correct UV map. Since the mask starts black, paint with white using any brush. As you paint, the grass instantly appears exactly where you're drawing on the surface. I can add as many scattering surface modifier as I need, for bushes, trees, whatever. Just don't forget to save these masks. Blender makes it easy, hit save all images and it packs every mask right into Blender file. Of course, when you close the file, Blender will remind you if any images aren't saved and offer to save them, so you will not lose them if you exit properly. But if Blender crashed, it will not ask. That's why it's smarter to double check and save the masks manually. Basically, the new scattering surface in Blender 5 is pretty simple to use, and I think it can easily handle about 95% of any tasks. It's available right here out of the box, and it's a big advantage, I think. Of course, add-ons like Geoscatter have way more functionality, and scattering surface isn't a competitor or full replacement for them, but for the most tasks you don't need that much, and for simple scattering this is more than enough. You just pick the model, draw a mask, and everything works. Most of the time that's everything that we need. Alright, another update in Blender 5 is sky texture. It's not entirely new, but in Blender 5 it's got a huge update. Now we've got a multiple scattering. So let's add the sky texture one more time to spot the difference, just like we usually do. And by default that new multiple scattering option is already enabled. On the Blender project we can see the difference between single scattering, the old sky texture, and multiple scattering with exactly the same settings. It looks way more natural and realistic. In my example we can compare it to. If I toggle between single and multiple, the difference shows up in how the sky texture works, for example in the shadows here. With multiple scattering it looks much more natural. In fact, it's already a full replacement for HDRI with the same tweakable settings as before. I especially love this in night and evening lighting. If we compare it to single scattering, that's a huge difference. This is single and this is multiple scattering. Way better overall. It really looks like using an HDRI. Look at that. This is awesome. I think I will not need to hunt for HDRI maps for my artworks anymore. I can fully replace them with sky texture using multiple scattering in Blender 5. It looks incredible. Unfortunately, we still can't add clouds directly in sky texture yet, and that's maybe the only disadvantage. Hopefully the devs will add this in future Blender releases. That would be really game-changing, because right now this already looks awesome, but with clouds, totally game-changer. For now I still use my own sky photos in the scene to get clouds, but overall sky texture in Blender 5 looks amazing. Another amazing scene in Blender 5 is right here in color management. Now Blender 5 brings built-in ACES support in color management. ACES, the industry standard wide dynamic range color system, is now built into Blender 5.0, and that's insane. Aces have a more dynamic range compared to everything we used before, especially Filmic and AGX in Blender. For example, how it looks in my scene. This is standard, Filmic, AGX, and compare it with Aces 2.0. And this is the default settings without post-production and color grading. But in practice it's more interesting for working with color gradient, since Aces has a wide dynamic range, we have more range for any adjustments. And I already switched to the Aces 2.0, and I think it will be my main color management in Blender for the next time. As you can see, I've got tons of nodes in the Compositor right now, and let's dive into compositing in Blender 5.0. Because the Compositor in Blender 5.0 has also new features. This is the Asset Shelf, built-in presets right in Blender. There aren't many built-in presets yet, as we can see. These are my presets from the Glow pack, and here are the Blender's built-in presets. And I find this very interesting, because now we can simply turn our render into something like this just in one click using Compositor and Assets. I love this sepia preset, it looks cool. Also, I like this one tune image, which we can use for doing post-production. This is a small node, but the basic things works well for adjustments. Also post effects, like vignette, instead of building my own node setup, just drop this one and it's already working. Also chromatic aberration, an amazing effect for that cinematic look. Just drag and drop this one and tweak the settings. But besides the built-in presets Blender gives us, we can save whatever we need right here as an asset to build our own presets. Make a group of nodes and save it as an asset to use in other projects. Also, for example, any frequently used nodes combination, so we don't have to rebuild them from scratch in every new project. For example, I almost every time use depth field to add fog to the render using depth layer, map range and mix color node. So I need a map range node and the depth layer. We can enable this layer in the render layers. I use the denoise data path for that. Next, I add the map range node to select the depth range where I want fog or haze, something like this. Then I grab a mix color node, plug the map range into the factor, switch the blending mode to screen, and use the color to add some fog. I've got a full tutorial on how exactly this works and how to use this trick in Blender compositing without volume and 3D scene, link in the corner and description to this video if you want to dive deeper into this topic. So, and every time to get this effect I have to create this combination of nodes, which is a bit boring. But I can easily save all this as a preset and use it in my other projects. To do this, first I group all these nodes, press Tab, go to inside this group, and here I need to set what I need in this group input. And I need map range settings and color settings. Also, we can name all the sockets as we want. This is going to be a depth map where we will connect the depth layer, and this is going to be our render. Press Tab to exit this group, and now we have only one node, which is way more useful. Let's name this node for better convenience. Then I open the outliner here and the Blender file. Here I need node group, find our node, this one, depth haze, select it and press mark as asset. And this node also appears here, as we can see. We can save nodes as a separate file, place it in the asset browser folder and use it every time we need in other projects. Just drag and drop into the compositor from the compositor assets. For visual distinctions among all these assets, we can upload our own icon for these created assets in the Blender asset browser. Of course, we could do this before, as you can see here, my compositing assets from the glow pack, but now it's convenient extra panel right inside the compositor in Blender. And of course, we can create tons of our own assets to save time. Make a group, set all the necessary settings in the group input, save it as an asset and use in other project. Just drag and drop the nodes into the compositor. So this is my compositing setup for this artwork. I experimented with built-in Blender assets here, as well as my own color grading and post-production. Blender keeps rolling out more and more new features that can easily wipe out some existing paid add-ons. With every update, Blender becoming more of only in Blender tool, the point where we will not even need any add-ons anymore, just pure Blender. Anyway, Blender 5.0 brings some pleasant things. Personally for me, as an environment artist, there is also this cool scene. In Blender 5 we have a compositor in video sequencer, but honestly I don't have much to say about it yet. I was insanely waiting for this new feature in Blender, and when I first tested it I was amazed. I mean, I can work with compositing right in video sequencer, and that's cool for animation because there is cache here, which is convenient for working with animations since the standard compositing doesn't have these things. I tested it for color correction, but then, after detailed analysis, I still don't understand why we need compositor in video sequencer. Basically, track and jump in animation frames gets skipped, and that's exactly what compositing is for, not just color grading, but for compositing materials. I thought they added it here to solve the cache problem for original compositing, but so far it doesn't work like I thought. And purely for color grading, well, I don't know. Anyway, we will see, maybe on release it will be working like I originally thought, and we will be able to use full compositing right here in video sequencer. Subscribe to my channel, also check out my Patreon to grab my assets, models and scenes from all the video tutorials. See you in the next time.